Every empire has a man the world calls monster before it calls him king. Caedric Ravenscar governed the northern province of Valamont the way winter governed the sea. Without apology, without hesitation, and without the slightest interest in being loved. He had buried rivals. He had silenced parliaments. He had turned Ravenscar Keep into a fortress so feared that enemy ships changed course rather than pass beneath its cannon towers. And then the crown sent him a woman he did not ask for, wrapped in silver silk and carrying enough defiance in her green eyes to crack stone. What happened next changed Valamont forever. Stay until the very end, because the moment you think you understand this man, everything turns. The cannon tower fired its sunrise salute at exactly 6 minutes past dawn. The blast rolled across frozen cliffs and shattered the silence that hung over Ravenscar Keep like a permanent bruise. Below the fortress walls, the northern sea churned between ice columns thick enough to crush merchant ships. Above, winter clouds pressed against Blackstone towers, as though the sky itself wanted distance from whatever lived inside. Caedric Ravenscar stood at the iron balcony of his war chamber, wearing a black military coat buttoned to his throat. Steam curled from the coffee he had not touched. His hands rested behind his back, leather gloves creased at the knuckles where he gripped his own wrist hard enough to leave marks nobody would ever see. 34 years old, 6 feet of controlled fury wrapped in tailored discipline, a jaw that looked carved from the same granite as his castle, dark hair pulled back severely from a face built for courtrooms and battlefields, and absolutely nothing tender. He watched the cannon smoke dissolve over the frozen harbor and calculated the reload time in his head without thinking about it. 4 minutes, 12 seconds. His artillery captain had been warned twice about exceeding 4 minutes. There would not be a third conversation. Behind him, the war chamber stretched 40 feet of cold stone, iron map tables, and weapons mounted along the walls not as decoration, but as inventory. Every blade had been used, every pistol had been fired. The room smelled like gunpowder residue, black tea, and leather polish. The 3 scents Caedric associated with civilization. A knock came at the oak door. "Enter," he said without turning. His steward, Brannock, stepped inside, carrying documents thick enough to suggest bad news. Brannock was 56, thin as a blade, and possessed the particular talent of delivering information without revealing whether he personally considered it catastrophic. Caedric valued that quality above almost everything else in human behavior. "The Crown's delegation arrived overnight, Your Grace." Brannock set the documents on the iron table with surgical precision. "They brought the engagement contract and the woman." Caedric's jaw tightened by exactly 1 degree. The movement was invisible to anyone who had not spent years studying him, which meant Brannock caught it immediately. "Her name? Lady Seraphina Vale, 3rd daughter of the Vale household, 26 years old." Brannock paused with the kind of hesitation that suggested the next sentence had been carefully edited before leaving his mouth. "She arrived without attendance, refused the carriage arrangement, rode the final 3 miles on horseback through the coastal ice road." Caedric turned slightly. Not his body, just his eyes. "Alone?" The crown escort fell behind at the harbor crossing. She did not wait for them. Something shifted behind Caedric's expression. Not interest exactly, more like the instinct of a predator registering movement in peripheral vision. "Where is she now?" "The East Reception Hall. She has been waiting 40 minutes. She has not sat down." Caedric said nothing for a long time. He studied the documents Brannock had delivered without opening them, as though the thickness of the paper alone told him what the crown expected. Political leverage. A strategic marriage designed to stabilize the northern territories by chaining Ravenscar authority to a noble house the crown could control. The mathematics were elementary. Valamont was too powerful. Caedric was too dangerous. The easiest method of containing a man who could not be defeated was to give him something worth protecting and then threaten to take it away. "Inform Lady Vale I will receive her in the throne hall at noon," he said quietly. "Not before." "She has already been waiting since noon." Brannock inclined his head and disappeared without further argument. Caedric picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway because discipline meant consuming what was available without complaint, a lesson carved into him during years he never discussed and would never discuss with any living person. He set the cup down and looked at the engagement documents one more time. Then he turned back to the frozen sea and let the wind cut across his face until he felt nothing at all. 3 hours later, the throne hall filled with the particular tension that preceded either ceremony or execution. Ravenscar's court gathered along the stone galleries in military dress and jeweled formality, their faces arranged into expressions of polished neutrality that concealed varying degrees of curiosity, ambition, and fear. The hall itself was designed for intimidation. 60-foot ceilings, iron chandeliers burning with hundreds of candles that cast moving shadows across black marble floors. The Ravenscar crest, a raven gripping a broken crown, hung above the throne in hammered silver large enough to be seen from the entrance doors 200 feet away. Caedric sat on the throne wearing the same black military coat, one leg crossed over the other, his posture communicating absolute ownership of every square foot of stone surrounding him. His dark eyes moved across the gathered court without settling on anyone long enough to suggest they mattered. Ministers whispered behind gloved hands. Military officers stood rigid along the walls. The air smelled like candle wax, cold stone, and the particular anxiety that Caedric's presence generated in rooms full of people who depended on his approval to survive. The doors opened. Seraphina Vale walked through them without escort. Silver silk, dark auburn hair pulled into a severe arrangement that emphasized the architecture of her face rather than softening it. Pale skin that caught candlelight like porcelain catching a flame, and eyes so deeply green they looked like something stolen from a forest that no longer existed. She walked the full length of the hall without hurrying. Every step landed with the controlled precision of someone who understood that pace communicated power. The court watched in the particular silence that meant something unexpected was happening. Most people who entered this hall for the first time moved quickly, eager to reach the throne and kneel and finish the ordeal. Seraphina moved as though the throne hall belonged to her, and Caedric was merely occupying it temporarily. She stopped 12 feet from the throne. The correct distance was 6. She did not kneel. The silence in the hall became a living thing, a pressure that filled the space between her defiance and his authority like water filling a crack in stone. Caedric studied her for 11 seconds without speaking. He counted them deliberately. 11 seconds was long enough to destroy most people's composure. Ambassadors had broken at 7. Military commanders had shifted their weight at 9. Seraphina met his gaze at second 1 and held it through second 11 without blinking. "You're 6 feet too far from the throne, Lady Vale," he said. His voice carried through the hall with the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to raise it. "And you are approximately 3 hours too late for basic courtesy, Your Grace," she answered. The court inhaled collectively. Caedric's fingers tightened on the armrest. The movement lasted half a second. He released it before anyone except possibly Brannock could register the reaction. "The Crown has sent you here under engagement orders," he continued, ignoring her response with the practiced ease of a man who controlled conversations the way generals controlled terrain. "You understand what that means?" "It means the Crown believes a woman can leash a man they are too frightened to confront directly." "And can she?" "I did not come here to leash anyone." Seraphina's voice dropped half a register, not louder but denser, the vocal equivalent of a blade being drawn slowly. "I came because refusing the Crown's order would have destroyed my family's remaining holdings, and I am not selfish enough to let pride cost other people their survival." Caedric tilted his head slightly. The movement was predatory and precise, the unconscious gesture of a man reassessing threat levels. "So you came out of duty?" "I came out of mathematics." She met his eyes without flinching. The numbers favored compliance. Something flickered behind his expression. Not warmth, not admiration. Something older and more dangerous than either. The recognition of his own operating system reflected in someone else's behavior. "Brannock," he said without looking away from Seraphina, "arrange quarters in the east wing, the corner suite." A murmur rippled through the court. The corner suite was reserved for visiting heads of state, not political hostages dressed as fiancés. The assignment communicated something Caedric had not intended to communicate, or perhaps had intended entirely. The engagement ceremony will occur in 14 days, he continued. Until then, you are a guest of Ravenscar. You will have access to the grounds, the library, and the dining hall. You will not enter the war chamber, the armory, or the North Tower. And if I find the boundaries unreasonable, then you will discover that Ravenscar's hospitality has limits that are enforced with precision rather than politeness. Seraphina looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since entering the hall, something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not submission. Something that looked disturbingly like evaluation, as though she had been measuring him since the moment she walked through the doors and had just now arrived at a preliminary conclusion. 14 days, she said quietly. I will be ready. She turned and walked back through the throne hall with the same unhurried pace, silver silk catching candlelight as she moved through shadows that parted around her like water around the bow of a warship. The court did not exhale until the doors closed behind her. Caedric sat motionless on the throne for a full minute after she left. Then he stood, descended the marble steps, and crossed the hall toward the war chamber without speaking to anyone. Brannock fell into step beside him. Your assessment? Caedric said. Dangerous, Your Grace. Elaborate. She is not performing defiance. She means it. Brannock paused at the war chamber door. And she rode 3 miles through coastal ice alone rather than wait for the crown's escort. That is not stubbornness. That is someone accustomed to depending only on herself. Caedric pushed the door open and stepped into the cold room where maps and weapons waited with the patient loyalty of objects that never disappointed him. Prepare the corner suite, he said, and double the guard rotation on the east wing. Protection or surveillance? Caedric looked at his steward with an expression that answered both possibilities simultaneously. Yes. The first 3 days established the geography of their war. Seraphina appeared at council dinners wearing gowns that fit the formal requirements of Ravenscar protocol while communicating through their severe cut and dark coloring that she considered the entire exercise a performance. She sat at the far end of the table from Caedric, ate sparingly, spoke only when addressed, and observed everything with the quiet intensity of a cartographer mapping enemy territory. On the second night, General Aldrich Mercer, Caedric's senior military commander, made the mistake of discussing troop deployments at the dinner table with the casual assumption that the woman at the end of it was either deaf or irrelevant. The eastern garrisons need reinforcement before the spring thaw, Mercer said through a mouthful of roasted game. If we pull 2 companies from the harbor watch, you would leave the harbor exposed during the highest traffic shipping season, Seraphina said without looking up from her plate. Silence crashed across the table like a wave hitting a seawall. Mercer's face reddened. Lady Vale, military strategy is hardly the concern of a woman who spent 4 years managing supply logistics for the Vale merchant fleet during the Southern blockade. She set down her fork with deliberate calm. You are right, General. What could I possibly know about troop distribution across maritime corridors? Mercer looked toward Caedric for support. Caedric was watching Seraphina with an expression that offered the general absolutely nothing resembling rescue. Continue, Lady Vale, Caedric said quietly. Every head at the table turned toward him. Seraphina met his gaze across 30 feet of mahogany and candlelight. Something passed between them that the court could sense but not identify. A frequency too high for ordinary ears, a negotiation conducted entirely through eye contact, and the dangerous electricity of 2 people recognizing that they were evenly matched. The harbor watch can be maintained at half strength if you rotate the coastal patrol schedule to 12-hour shifts instead of 8, she said. The eastern garrisons receive reinforcement. The harbor keeps coverage. You lose nothing except the assumption that your current system is the only one that works. Mercer opened his mouth to argue. Implement it, Caedric said. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Mercer closed his mouth. Ministers exchanged glances that communicated varying degrees of shock. Brannock's expression remained perfectly neutral, which was his version of astonishment. After dinner, Caedric found himself standing at the iron balcony of the war chamber for the second time that day, staring at the frozen harbor and running Seraphina's logistics analysis through his mind with the uncomfortable realization that it was not merely competent, it was better than his own. He gripped the iron railing until the cold metal bit through his gloves. Competence he could respect. Competence he could use. What disturbed him was something beneath the competence. The particular quality in her voice when she had spoken. The absolute absence of performance or flattery, the way she had delivered superior analysis without any interest in being congratulated for it. She operated the way he operated, and that was not something Caedric Ravenscar had ever encountered in another person. On the fourth night, the piano started. Caedric was reviewing parliamentary correspondence in the war chamber at 2 a.m. when the sound drifted through stone corridors like smoke from a fire burning in a room that should have been empty. He set down his pen. The music was not gentle. It was not decorative. It was the sound of someone playing as though the piano had personally wronged them, and the only acceptable response was controlled violence delivered through 88 keys. He followed the sound through darkened hallways where torch sconces threw orange light across stone walls until he reached the west salon. The door was open 3 inches. Through the gap, he saw Seraphina sitting at the grand piano in a white linen shift, her dark hair unbound and falling across her shoulders, her bare feet pressing the pedals with the same controlled intensity she brought to everything. Her fingers moved across the keys with precision that bordered on fury. The music filled the salon like a living presence, complex, restrained, and barely containing something enormous beneath its surface. Caedric stood in the corridor and listened for 7 minutes without entering. He told himself he was assessing a security risk. The East Wing resident was out of her quarters past midnight. Protocol required awareness. Awareness required observation. Observation was not the same thing as fascination. The lie held for approximately 90 seconds before he abandoned it. On the 8th day, Seraphina walked through the servants' quarters. This fact reached Caedric through Brannock, who delivered it with the carefully modulated neutrality he reserved for information that was simultaneously insignificant and potentially catastrophic. She spent 2 hours below stairs, Brannock reported. She learned the names of 14 servants. She asked the head cook about his daughter's fever. She carried water from the well for the laundry staff when the pipeline froze. Caedric looked up from his maps. Why? I asked her the same question, Your Grace. And? She said, because nobody else did. The words landed in Caedric's chest with a precision that no weapon in his armory had ever achieved. He turned back to his maps without responding, but the cartography in front of him had stopped making sense 3 days ago, and the lines he traced now followed routes that led nowhere except back toward a woman playing violent music in a room he had no business entering. On the 10th night, he entered it anyway. The west salon was dark except for the fireplace and 2 candelabras flanking the piano. Seraphina's fingers stopped the moment his boots crossed the threshold. She did not turn around. You have been standing in the corridor for 3 nights, she said. I was beginning to wonder if you intended to remain there permanently. Caedric closed the door behind him. The latch clicked with a finality that sounded larger than its mechanism should have allowed. You knew I was there. Sound carries through stone. She turned on the bench to face him. Firelight moved across her features, creating shadows that made her look older than 26 and younger than forever. And you breathe louder than you think. He crossed the room until 6 feet separated them, the same distance she had maintained in the throne hall. He recognized the geometry and understood that she was telling him something. Why do you play at 2 a.m? Because at 2 a.m, there is no audience, no court, no expectation. She held his gaze without hesitation. The music is honest when nobody is listening. I was listening. You were watching. There is a difference. Caedric felt the distinction cut through something he kept heavily armored. Watching was surveillance. Listening was intimacy. And intimacy was a weapon he had disarmed from his own arsenal years ago because it created vulnerabilities that enemies exploited with surgical enthusiasm. You disapprove of my rule, he said, shifting to terrain where he held advantage. I disapprove of a man who has convinced himself that isolation is the same thing as strength. She stood from the piano bench. The white linen shift moved against her silhouette in the firelight, and Caedric forced his eyes to remain on her face with a discipline that cost him more than any battle ever had. You built Ravenscar into a fortress because fortresses cannot be hurt, but they also cannot be reached, and anything that cannot be reached eventually stops being worth reaching for. That is a philosophical position, not a military one. Everything you say is military. That is the problem. She stepped closer, 5 feet now. You assess threats. You calculate losses. You fortify perimeters. But when was the last time you stood inside a room without scanning it for exits? The question hit him with the force of a cannon blast fired at point-blank range, because the answer was never. He had never stood inside a room without calculating the fastest path to the door, the nearest weapon, the most defensible position. Not since he was 19, not since the night his own family demonstrated exactly what happened to men who trusted the wrong heartbeat. "You do not know me well enough to speak with that certainty," he said. His voice had dropped to a register that most people interpreted as warning. Seraphina seemed to interpret it as confirmation. "I know that you drink your coffee cold because you refuse to ask anyone to reheat it. I know you grip your own wrist behind your back until it leaves marks because physical pain gives you something controllable to feel. I know you doubled the guard on my wing and told Brannick it was for surveillance, but the guards face outward, not inward. You are protecting me from something you have not told me about." She paused. "And I know you have listened to me play for 3 consecutive nights without once asking me to stop." The firelight crackled between them. Caedric stood motionless. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to end this conversation, to retreat behind the walls he had spent 15 years constructing from betrayal and discipline and the absolute refusal to let another person see the machinery running beneath his composure. Instead, he heard himself say something that violated every principle he governed by. "The music was the first sound in this castle I did not want to silence." Seraphina's breath caught. The reaction was small, a slight parting of her lips, a micro-expansion of her pupils that the firelight made visible. She had expected resistance. She had prepared arguments for resistance. She had not prepared for honesty. "Caedric, do not," he said sharply, and the word came out harder than he intended because his own name and her voice did something to the architecture of his chest that he could not reverse engineer or defend against. "Do not mistake one honest sentence for an invitation." "An invitation to what?" "To believing you can save me." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire popped behind her. Somewhere in the castle, a guard changed posts. The world continued its mechanical operation around 2 people standing 5 feet apart in a room where honesty had just become more dangerous than any weapon mounted on the walls outside. "I am not here to save you," she said quietly. "I am here because the crown traded me like currency, and I intend to survive it. But I will not pretend that surviving means closing my eyes to a man who has been bleeding in plain sight for 15 years while an entire kingdom calls it leadership." She turned back to the piano. Her fingers found the keys. The music began again. Not softer, not gentler, but different in a way that Caedric could feel behind his sternum, like a second heartbeat trying to synchronize with his first. He left the salon without another word. In the corridor, he pressed his back against the cold stone wall and listened to the music pour through the door he had closed, but could no longer lock. He stood there until the sun came up. 2 mornings later, Brannick entered the war chamber carrying a sealed document stamped with the royal crest and marked with the crimson wax that indicated parliamentary urgency. His expression had abandoned neutrality for something closer to clinical alarm. "This arrived with the morning courier," he said, "directly from the Crown's intelligence office." Caedric broke the seal and read the document in 14 seconds. He read it again in 12. Then he set it on the iron table with a steadiness that contradicted everything happening behind his eyes. "How many names?" Brannick asked. 7 noble houses. Confirmed coordination. Armed mobilization scheduled before the spring parliamentary summit. Caedric's voice was flat, factual. The voice of a man converting fury into data, because data could be weaponized and fury could not. "They intend to strip Ravenscar authority through a combined vote of no confidence backed by military demonstration." "The Vale household?" Caedric looked at his steward. "Her brother," he said. "Lord Damien Vale. 3rd name on the list." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Ravenscar Keep had produced since the cannon salute at dawn. Brannick stood perfectly still. "Does she know?" Caedric picked up the document and held it near the candle flame. The paper curled and blackened. He watched it burn with the expression of a man who understood that the next 48 hours would determine whether the woman playing piano in his West Salon was the most important person in his life or the most dangerous. "Not yet," he said. And somewhere in the East Wing, Seraphina Vale sat at her window watching snow fall over the frozen harbor, unaware that the brother she had sacrificed everything to protect had just signed his name to the document that could destroy the only man who had ever listened to her play. Caedric did not sleep that night. He stood over the iron map table in the war chamber with every candle burning and every door locked, studying troop positions across the northern territories, while the intelligence document's contents replayed behind his eyes in a continuous loop that no amount of strategic analysis could interrupt. 7 noble houses, coordinated military assets, a parliamentary coup timed for the spring summit, and the name Damien Vale sitting third on the list like a knife someone had slid between his ribs while he was busy listening to piano music at 2 in the morning. He pressed both fists against the iron table until his knuckles whitened. The mathematics of survival were elementary. Seraphina was either complicit or ignorant. If complicit, she was the most sophisticated intelligence operative he had ever encountered, and the warmth he had felt in the West Salon was engineered bait designed to compromise his judgment at the exact moment his enemies needed him blind. If ignorant, she was a woman whose brother had weaponized her sacrifice without telling her, and the engagement the Crown had arranged was not merely political containment, but active positioning, placing a veil inside Ravenscar's walls during the precise window when those walls would come under siege. Both options demanded the same response: control, distance, tactical reassessment. Caedric straightened and adjusted his gloves with mechanical precision. He would treat this the way he treated every threat. He would gather intelligence, verify sources, identify weak points, and act decisively before his enemies finished assembling their formation. He would not think about the way her voice had sounded when she said his name. He would not think about it because thinking about it made his chest do something structurally unsound, and structural failure during active threat assessment was a luxury that got men killed. At 7 in the morning, he summoned General Mercer. Mercer arrived in full military dress with his beard freshly trimmed and his expression set to the particular frequency of professional readiness that career soldiers maintained when they suspected the conversation ahead would involve orders they did not want to receive. "Close the door," Caedric said. Mercer closed it. He stood in front of the map table with his hands clasped behind his back and waited. How long would it take to mobilize the full Ravenscar garrison? Mercer's eyes narrowed. Defensive or offensive deployment? Both, simultaneously. The general's composure shifted by approximately 2 degrees. 12 days for full mobilization. 8 if we pull reserves from the harbor watch and coastal patrols. You have 6. 6 days is not 6 days, General, and I need it done without alerting the parliamentary observers stationed in the capital district. Caedric placed both hands flat on the map table and leaned forward until his weight pressed against the iron surface. The noble houses of Ashworth, Pemberton, Hale, Drayton, Montague, Whitmore, and Vale have entered a coordinated alliance to strip Ravenscar authority before the spring summit. They intend to back the parliamentary motion with armed demonstration. Mercer's face lost color in stages, like a tide retreating from a beach. 7 houses, that is half the northern aristocracy. It is exactly half, which means the other half has not yet decided where to stand. Our window for securing their loyalty closes the moment the conspirators realize their intelligence has been compromised. How reliable is this information? Crown Intelligence. Sealed courier. The source is internal to the conspiracy, which means someone inside those 7 houses is hedging their position by feeding information to both sides. Caedric traced a line across the map from the eastern garrisons to the capital. I want every supply route between the conspirator territories and Valemount mapped, monitored, and prepared for interdiction. I want the harbor fortified. I want the artillery batteries at full capacity, and I want it done quietly. Mercer studied the map with the calculating focus of a man whose entire career had been building toward a moment exactly like this one. The Vale household. Does Lady Seraphina... Lady Seraphina is not your concern. The sentence came out with an edge that cut the question off at the root. Mercer recognized the tone. He had heard it once before, 7 years ago, when Caedric had ordered the arrest of his own cousin for treason. That conversation had also ended with a voice that sounded like a door being locked from the inside. Understood, Your Grace. 6 days, General, not 7, not 6.5. 6. Mercer saluted and left the war chamber with the particular urgency of a man who understood that failure would not result in a second conversation. Caedric remained at the map table for 20 minutes after Mercer departed. He studied troop positions and supply lines and defensive formations with the obsessive precision of a man who was very good at pretending that military strategy was the only thing occupying his mind. Then he walked to the east wing. He told himself it was surveillance. The lie lasted exactly as long as it took to reach her door. He knocked once, hard, the way he knocked on the doors of ministers he intended to interrogate. Seraphina opened it wearing a dark green dress that turned her eyes into something he could not look at directly without his concentration fragmenting. Her hair was pulled back. No jewelry, no artifice. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly, without the protective lens of court protocol that every other human being in this castle used to shield themselves from contact with his actual personality. "It is 7:30 in the morning," she said. "Has the castle caught fire? Or are you simply incapable of normal visiting hours? Walk with me." "Where?" "The north battlements." She studied his face for 3 seconds. Whatever she found there made her reach for the heavy wool cloak hanging beside the door without further argument. They walked through the castle corridors in silence. Guards straightened as they passed. Servants pressed themselves against stone walls. The castle's population had developed an instinct for measuring the atmospheric pressure around Caedric Ravenscar, and this morning the pressure was dropping fast enough to suggest a storm that had nothing to do with weather. The north battlements stretched along the cliff edge above the frozen sea. Wind cut across the stone walkway with enough force to make Seraphina's cloak snap behind her like a flag. Below them, ice columns groaned and fractured against the base of the cliffs, in a sound that resembled bones breaking under pressure. Caedric stopped at the battlement wall and gripped the frozen stone with both hands. He stared at the horizon, where gray sea met gray sky in a line so featureless it looked like the world simply stopped existing beyond a certain distance. "When did you last speak with your brother?" The question landed between them like a blade dropped on marble. Seraphina's breathing changed, not dramatically. A slight acceleration, a fractional tightening of rhythm that someone less attuned to human micro-reactions would have missed entirely. Caedric heard it the way he heard artillery reload times, automatically, precisely, without needing to think about what the data meant. 3 months ago, she said, before the Crown issued the engagement order. Why? What did he tell you about his political activities? Damien does not discuss politics with me. He considers me useful for managing logistics and irrelevant for everything else. Her voice carried the particular flatness that accompanies statements which have been true for so long they no longer generate emotional response. Why are you asking about my brother at 7:30 in the morning on a battlement where the wind is trying to kill us? Caedric turned to face her. The wind pushed his dark hair across his forehead. His eyes were the color of iron in winter light, and they held the expression of a man conducting an interrogation he desperately wanted to fail. "Look at me," he said. "I am looking at you. Look at me and tell me whether you knew." "Knew what?" "That your brother has joined a coalition of 7 noble houses planning to overthrow Ravenscar authority before the spring summit." The color drained from Seraphina's face the way daylight drains from a room when storm clouds cover the sun. It happened all at once. A complete systemic response that no amount of training or preparation could manufacture. Her pupils dilated, her lips parted. Her hands, which had been gripping the edges of her cloak against the wind, went still. Caedric watched every reaction with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years reading human deception across negotiation tables and battlefield surrenders. He cataloged each micro-expression against his internal database of manufactured shock versus genuine shock. The dilation pattern was involuntary. The blood drainage was cardiovascular, not muscular. The hand stillness was freeze response, not calculated composure. She did not know. The realization hit him with the force of something he had not expected to feel. Relief so intense it made his jaw clench to contain it. "That is not possible," she said. Her voice had dropped to a frequency he had never heard from her before. Not the controlled precision of the throne hall, not the fierce intelligence of the dinner table. Something stripped of all performance, raw signal without encryption. Damien would not. The engagement was supposed to protect the Vale holdings. He agreed to it. He signed the documents himself. He signed the engagement documents to place a Vale inside Ravenscar's walls during the exact window his coalition planned to attack. Caedric delivered the words with surgical flatness because anything softer would have been dishonest. And dishonesty at this moment would have been a form of cruelty worse than the truth. Your sacrifice was strategic positioning, not protection. Seraphina turned away from him and gripped the battlement wall with both hands. Her knuckles went white against the frozen stone. The wind tore at her hair, pulling strands free from their arrangement and whipping them across her face, while she stared at the sea below with an expression that contained something enormous, being compressed into something survivable. She did not cry. Caedric noticed this the way he noticed load-bearing walls and buildings under stress. She absorbed the impact internally, distributing it across her entire structure rather than allowing it to concentrate at a single failure point. "How long have you known?" she asked without turning around. 18 hours. "And you waited until now to tell me because you needed time to determine whether I was part of it." It was not a question. Caedric did not insult her by pretending otherwise. "Yes. And your conclusion?" "You did not know." She turned back to face him. The wind had reddened her cheeks and pulled her hair into disorder, and her green eyes held something that Caedric recognized because he saw it in his own reflection every morning. The particular expression of a person who has just been betrayed by someone they loved enough to sacrifice for, and who is currently converting that betrayal into fuel for whatever comes next. "What happens now?" she said. "Now I prepare Valamont for war." "And me?" He looked at her for a long time. The wind howled between them, carrying salt and ice and the sound of a frozen sea trying to break itself apart against the base of the cliffs. In the distance, a supply ship crawled along the horizon line, its sails barely visible against the gray sky. "You remain at Ravenscar as a hostage, as whatever you decide to be." He stepped closer. The wind pressed his coat against his body and pushed her cloak against hers, and for a moment the fabric between them moved as though the atmosphere itself was trying to close the distance their bodies refused to close. "I have enemies in every direction, Seraphina. 7 noble houses want my authority. The crown wants my compliance. Parliament wants my silence. Your brother wants my destruction." He paused. "But you are the only person inside these walls who has ever told me the truth without calculating what it would cost. And that makes me what? Valuable? That makes you dangerous. To me, in ways I am not equipped to defend against." The honesty in his voice was almost physically visible, a crack in armor plate that should have been seamless. Seraphina heard it the way musicians hear a single note that does not belong to the composition but changes the entire meaning of the piece. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest, not gently, not romantically, with the firm diagnostic pressure of someone checking whether a wall was solid or hollow. His heartbeat slammed against her hand hard enough for both of them to feel it. "Your heart is racing," she said. "I am aware." The Duke of Ravenscar, who does not flinch when cannons fire, whose pulse stays flat through parliamentary ambushes, whose composure has never cracked in front of a single living person. She kept her hand pressed against his chest. "Your heart is racing because a woman touched you." "My heart is racing because the wrong woman touched me at the worst possible moment in the worst possible situation, and the fact that I am allowing it to continue is evidence that my judgment has been compromised in a way that will very likely get both of us killed." "Then step back." He did not step back. The wind screamed across the battlements, ice cracked against the cliffs below. The entire frozen world around them continued its brutal, indifferent operation, while 2 people stood on the edge of a fortress and faced the particular terror of wanting something that made you weaker in a world that punished weakness with annihilation. Caedric reached up and removed her hand from his chest. He held it for exactly 2 seconds longer than removal required. Then he released it and stepped back with the controlled precision of a man retreating from an engagement he could not win. "I need to know everything about your brother's network," he said. His voice had returned to operational register. The crack in the armor had been welded shut, but the seam remained visible if you knew where to look. Every contact, every associate, every financial connection the Vale household maintains with the other 6 houses. You are asking me to betray my own family. I am asking you to choose between a brother who sold you as a strategic asset and a man who is telling you the truth at the cost of his own tactical advantage. He met her eyes. I could have kept this information from you, used it as leverage, waited until the attack came, and let the evidence speak for itself while you stood in the wreckage wondering why your fiancé had not warned you. Why did you not? The question hung in the wind like a flag with no insignia. Caedric looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked once, the muscles flexing beneath skin that the cold had drawn tight across his bones. He looked like a man standing on the wrong side of a decision he had already made. Because you played honest music in a castle full of liars, he said, and I am tired of rewarding dishonesty by treating it as the default. He turned and walked back along the battlements toward the castle entrance. His black coat snapped in the wind. His boots struck the stone walkway with the measured cadence of a man who governed his own body the way he governed his province, with absolute authority and no tolerance for deviation. Behind him, Seraphina stood at the battlement wall with the wind tearing at her hair and her brother's betrayal settling into her bones like frost-penetrating stone. She stayed there for 11 minutes. Then she walked back inside, found Brannock in the east corridor, and asked him for parchment, ink, and a list of every financial ledger the Vale household had filed with the Northern Tax Authority in the last 3 years. Brannock looked at her with an expression that, for the first time in his career, contained something resembling respect. I will have them in your quarters within the hour, my lady. Make it 30 minutes. 3 days later, the midwinter assembly preparations consumed Ravenscar Keep like a controlled fire spreading through a building designed to burn beautifully. Brannock coordinated the logistics with the ruthless efficiency of a man who understood that formal gatherings at Ravenscar were not celebrations but strategic operations conducted under chandelier light. Staff polished silver until it reflected like mirrors. The kitchens operated around the clock, producing courses elaborate enough to distract aristocratic attention from whatever was happening beneath the surface of the evening. Musicians rehearsed in the East Gallery. Florists arranged winter roses along the grand staircase. And behind every preparation, invisible to anyone not actively looking for it, Caedric positioned his military assets like chess pieces being moved into formation during the opening they were trained to dominate. Seraphina had delivered 23 pages of intelligence on the Vale household's financial connections to the other conspirator families. The information was devastating. Bank transfers routed through shell companies in the southern provinces. Arms purchases disguised as agricultural equipment orders. Communication networks operating through compromised diplomatic pouches. Caedric read every page twice in the war chamber at midnight, while the fire burned low and the shadows grew long against the weapon-lined walls. She did not hesitate, Brannock said from the doorway. He was watching Caedric read with the careful attention of a man who understood that his employer's decision-making process was currently operating under conditions it had never been tested against. No, Caedric said without looking up. She did not. That concerns you. It concerns me that someone capable of this level of decisive betrayal against her own blood is either the most principled person I have ever met or the most dangerous. He set the documents down and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. The gesture was uncharacteristic enough that Brannock registered it as significant. Caedric Ravenscar did not display fatigue. He did not display anything. The fact that he was rubbing his eyes in the presence of another human being meant something had shifted in the internal architecture of a man who had not shown structural change in 15 years. Which do you believe she is? Brannock asked. Both. Caedric lowered his hands. And that is why she is more dangerous than the 7 houses combined. The evening of the midwinter assembly arrived with the weight of a storm system moving ashore. Carriages lined the coastal road below Ravenscar Keep, their lanterns cutting orange lines through the falling snow as noble families arrived from across the northern territories. The castle blazed with light from every window. Music drifted across the frozen grounds. From a distance, it looked like warmth and celebration. From inside, it felt like a loaded weapon with the safety removed. Turrets, Caedric dressed in his black military formal, gold medals aligned across his chest with geometric precision, his sword hanging at his left hip in a scabbard polished to mirror finish. He stood at the top of the grand staircase and watched the ballroom fill below him. Aristocrats in silk and velvet, military officers in dress uniform, ministers in parliamentary black, and among them, moving through the crowd with practiced social grace that concealed varying degrees of treachery, the representatives of 7 noble houses who intended to destroy everything he had built. He identified them without effort. Ashworth near the east windows, laughing too loudly. Pemberton by the refreshment table, watching the room with eyes that tracked exits rather than conversation partners. Hale speaking to a cluster of military wives with the performative warmth of a man who needed witnesses to his charm. Drayton, Montague, Whitmore, all present. All performing innocence with the desperate commitment of people who understood that their survival depended on the next 6 hours going exactly as planned. And then Seraphina descended the staircase. She wore midnight blue. The gown was cut with architectural severity that emphasized the line of her shoulders and the length of her neck. Her dark hair was arranged with crystal pins that caught chandelier light and scattered it in fragments across the marble walls. She looked like a weapon someone had dressed in silk. Every eye in the ballroom found her simultaneously. Caedric watched from the top of the staircase. His hand rested on the marble railing. His grip tightened without his permission. She reached the ballroom floor and moved through the crowd with the same unhurried pace she had used the day she walked into his throne hall. Nobles parted around her. Conversations paused. The particular electricity she generated in rooms was not beauty exactly. It was the energy of a person who understood her own coordinates in hostile territory and refused to pretend the territory was friendly. She stopped at the center of the ballroom and looked up at him. Across 60 feet of chandelier-lit marble, through the noise and movement and calculated deception of 200 aristocrats performing loyalty they did not feel, their eyes locked. And Caedric understood with absolute clarity that the next decision he made would determine not just the survival of his authority, but the architecture of whatever he was becoming in the presence of a woman who had already changed the structural engineering of his entire existence. He descended the staircase. Every step brought him closer to the ballroom floor where his enemies waited, where the conspiracy that could destroy Ravenscar breathed and smiled and drank his wine. Every step brought him closer to the woman standing at the center of it all. Not as a conspirator, not as a hostage, but as something the entire political framework of the Northern Territories had failed to account for. A variable that could not be controlled. He reached her. The crowd pulled back instinctively, creating a circle of empty marble around them that functioned as both stage and arena. "You look like you are walking into battle," she said quietly. "I am." He extended his hand. The gesture was visible to every person in the ballroom. Ministers registered it. Generals noted it. The conspirators from 7 noble houses watched the Duke of Ravenscar offer his hand to the sister of a man who had signed documents calling for his destruction, and they understood that the evening they had planned was about to become something none of them had prepared for. Seraphina took his hand. The orchestra began playing, and at the far end of the ballroom, Lord Cedric Thorne, Caedric's longest-standing political rival and the architect of the entire conspiracy, stepped through the entrance doors carrying a leather portfolio stamped with the seals of 7 noble houses and the unmistakable expression of a man who believed he was about to end a dynasty. The collision was minutes away, and Caedric Ravenscar had just publicly declared, in front of every person who wanted him destroyed, that the woman on his arm was worth more than the fortress he had spent 15 years building around a heart he no longer controlled. There would be no retreat from this position. There never was. Lord Cedric Thorne crossed the ballroom floor carrying the leather portfolio the way executioners carried axes, with ceremonial patience and absolute confidence in the outcome. The orchestra continued playing, guests continued drinking. The chandelier light continued its mechanical performance of warmth across 200 faces that had not yet registered the shift in atmospheric pressure that Caedric felt the instant Thorne's boot struck marble. He knew, not intellectually, deeper. The way animals knew weather before the sky changed. Something in the architecture of the room had just been rearranged, and the rearrangement pointed toward a confrontation that Thorne had been engineering long before tonight. Caedric's hand tightened around Seraphina's fingers. The pressure was involuntary. He corrected it immediately, but the half-second of compression was enough for her to feel the shift. "What is it?" she said without turning her head. "Thorn. East entrance. He is carrying documents." Seraphina's pulse accelerated against his palm. He felt it through the thin fabric of her glove, a biological signal that confirmed she understood exactly what documents meant when carried into a ballroom by a man whose entire career had been built on destroying people in public. The conspiracy files. Something worse. Something he wants the entire room to see. Thorn moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who understood the performative mechanics of aristocratic destruction. He smiled. He nodded at passing nobles. He accepted a crystal glass from a servant and held it without drinking. Every gesture communicated relaxation, control, and the specific confidence of someone who had already decided how the evening would end and was simply waiting for the clock to reach the appointed minute. He stopped 30 feet from Caedric and Seraphina. The circle of empty marble that surrounded them, the space the crowd had instinctively created when the Duke took his fiancée's hand, now functioned as a stage, and Thorn positioned himself at the edge of it with the spatial precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "Your Grace." Thorn's voice carried the particular warmth of a blade being heated before use. "A magnificent assembly, as always. Ravenscar hospitality remains unmatched." "Lord Thorn." Caedric's response was flat, factual, the vocal equivalent of a wall with no doors. "I was not aware you had accepted the invitation." "I accepted this morning. Forgive the late confirmation. I had business to attend to in the capital." Thorn lifted the leather portfolio slightly. The gesture was small, casual, devastating. "Business that I believe the assembled nobility would find extraordinarily relevant to the future of the Northern Territories." The temperature in the ballroom dropped by several degrees that had nothing to do with the winter outside. Nobles within earshot began migrating toward the conversation with the instinctive movement of a crowd sensing spectacle. Ministers set down their glasses. Military officers straightened against the walls. The orchestra continued playing, but its music had become background noise, competing against a silence that was somehow louder. Caedric released Seraphina's hand. The separation was tactical. Whatever was about to happen required both of his hands free and his attention distributed across the entire room, rather than concentrated on a single point of contact that made his thinking slower and his pulse faster. "If you have business with Ravenscar, Lord Thorn, my council chamber is available. Private conversations tend to produce more productive outcomes than public theater." "On the contrary, Your Grace." Thorn opened the leather portfolio with the careful movements of a surgeon exposing an incision. "This particular business requires witnesses." He extracted a document. Even from 30 feet, Caedric recognized the formatting: Crown Intelligence Correspondence, official parliamentary seal. The same document structure he had received from Brannock 3 days ago, detailing the seven-house conspiracy against Ravenscar authority. But this document was different. Thorn held it up so the chandelier light caught the text, and his voice rose with the projection of a man who had spent decades in parliamentary debate and understood exactly how to make a room listen. 3 weeks ago, the Crown's Intelligence Office intercepted communications between several noble houses discussing potential political reorganization of the Northern Territories. Thorn paused for effect. The room was now completely silent except for the orchestra, which had finally stopped playing as the musicians recognized that their performance was no longer the evening's main event. The intelligence report named 7 families, 7 houses accused of conspiracy against the Duke of Ravenscar. He turned to face the room. "I am here tonight to confirm that the conspiracy is real." The ballroom erupted in murmured shock. Nobles exchanged glances. Ministers gripped their own lapels. The sound that moved through the crowd was the particular frequency of collective alarm that Caedric had heard before in war chambers and parliamentary sessions, but never inside his own ballroom during an event he had hosted to identify these exact conspirators. Thorn was ahead of him. The realization hit Caedric with the physical force of a blow to the sternum. Thorn had not come tonight to be exposed. He had come to expose himself, on his own terms, under his own narrative control, in a setting where the optics of the revelation could be weaponized against Ravenscar rather than against the conspiracy. The 7 houses acted because the Northern Territories have been governed for 15 years by a man who rules through intimidation, punishes dissent through isolation, and treats the aristocratic families who built this province as subordinates rather than partners. Thorne's voice hardened. We did not conspire against Ravenscar out of ambition. We conspired because the alternative was to watch the Northern Territories suffocate under the authority of a man who has confused tyranny with governance. Caedric stood motionless at the center of the ballroom. His face revealed nothing. His body revealed nothing. 15 years of discipline had built a surface so controlled that even genuine shock registered as calm, and the calm itself became a weapon because it communicated to the room that the Duke of Ravenscar had anticipated this moment. He had not anticipated this moment. He was improvising, and the fact that improvisation looked identical to preparation was the only advantage he currently possessed. Thorne continued. Among the documents I hold is a complete financial record of the conspiracy's funding structure, arms acquisitions, communication networks, troop positioning. Every detail the Crown's Intelligence Office collected has been verified by parliamentary investigators. He paused and turned to face Caedric directly, including the detail that Lady Seraphina Vale provided 23 pages of intelligence on her own family's involvement, intelligence delivered directly to the Duke 3 days ago. The room pivoted towards Seraphina like a weapon finding its target. Caedric felt the shift in atmospheric pressure, the way buildings feel earthquakes, a structural tremor that traveled through the foundation and reached every load-bearing wall simultaneously. Thorne had not merely revealed the conspiracy. He had revealed Seraphina's betrayal of her brother, reframing it from an act of conscience into evidence that Ravenscar had turned a political hostage into an intelligence asset against her own blood. The implications were surgical. Seraphina was no longer a woman who had chosen truth. She was a woman who had been coerced, manipulated, weaponized by a duke whose power was so absolute that he could turn a fiancé against her family within 2 weeks of her arrival. Your Grace, Thorne's voice dropped to the particular register that parliamentary debaters used when delivering killing strokes. I formally request that the Crown's observers present tonight take testimony from Lady Vale regarding the conditions under which she provided intelligence against the Vale household. If she acted freely, the conspiracy stands condemned. If she acted under duress, Ravenscar's methods stand condemned instead. The trap was flawless. Caedric recognized its architecture with the grudging precision of a strategist confronting superior tactics. Thorne had converted a defensive exposure into an offensive weapon. By revealing the conspiracy himself, he controlled the narrative. By highlighting Seraphina's intelligence contribution, he transformed her from an ally into a liability. And by requesting Crown testimony, he forced Caedric into a position where any attempt to protect Seraphina would be interpreted as consciousness of guilt. If Caedric allowed the testimony, Seraphina would be interrogated by Crown observers who reported to the same parliamentary structure the conspirators intended to control. If he refused the testimony, the refusal itself became evidence that he had coerced her. The mathematics of the situation reduced to 0 acceptable outcomes. Caedric looked at Seraphina. She stood 7 feet to his left, her midnight blue gown catching chandelier light, while 200 aristocrats stared at her with expressions ranging from sympathy to suspicion to the calculated neutrality of people who were already deciding which side of the coming fracture would be safer to stand on. Her face was pale. Her hands were steady. Her green eyes held the expression of a woman who was watching the architecture of her sacrifice being dismantled in real time by a man who understood leverage better than she had estimated. Their eyes met. In the contact between his gaze and hers, Caedric felt something break. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical sound of shattering glass or splintering wood. Quietly, internally. The way a wall breaks when the pressure on both sides finally exceeds its structural tolerance, not with a crash, but with a slow, grinding shift that changes the geometry of everything built on top of it. He had spent 15 years constructing a system of governance based on the principle that emotional attachments were strategic vulnerabilities. Every decision he had ever made confirmed this principle. Every betrayal he had survived validated it. The architecture of Ravenscar, from its cannon towers to its intelligence networks, was built on the foundation of a man who trusted no heartbeat except his own. And now that foundation was cracking because a woman he had known for 12 days was standing in his ballroom, being publicly dismantled by his enemies, and every cell in his body was screaming at him to do something about it, regardless of what it cost. The cost would be everything. He understood that with perfect clarity. Protecting Seraphina in this moment, publicly, visibly, against direct parliamentary challenge, would confirm every accusation Thorn was making. It would prove that the Duke of Ravenscar had been compromised, that his judgment had been corrupted by attachment, that the fortress had a weakness, and the weakness wore midnight blue and had green eyes and played violent piano music at 2 a.m. The alternative was to let her stand alone, to sacrifice her credibility, her dignity, and possibly her freedom to crown interrogators in order to preserve the political position that kept Ravenscar in power and Valemount under his authority. Survival demanded the sacrifice. Every principle he had governed by for 15 years demanded the sacrifice. And Caedric Ravenscar, the man who had never once allowed emotion to override strategic calculation, the man who had built an empire on the absolute refusal to let vulnerability enter his decision-making process, looked at the woman standing 7 feet away from him and made the first purely irrational choice of his life. He descended the 3 marble steps that separated him from the main ballroom floor. He crossed the open space between himself and Seraphina with the deliberate pace of a man who wanted the room to register every step. He stopped beside her, turned to face Lord Thorn and the 200 aristocrats watching with collective held breath, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall with the cold clarity of a cannon shot across open water. Lady Vale provided intelligence on the conspiracy voluntarily, without coercion, without solicitation, without any instruction from me. He paused. She did it because she discovered that her own brother had used her as a strategic asset, sold her into an engagement designed not to protect the Vale household, but to position a spy inside Ravenscar's walls, and she chose truth over blood. The room went still. If Lord Thorn wishes to request testimony from Lady Vale, he is welcome to do so. She will speak freely. She will answer every question. And when she is finished, every person in this room will understand that the conspiracy against Ravenscar was not an act of political conscience, but a coordinated military operation funded by arms dealers, supported by foreign banking interests, and designed to destabilize the Northern Territories for the personal enrichment of 7 families who confused their ambition with governance. Caedric reached down and took Seraphina's hand. The gesture was visible, public, irrevocable. He drew her against his side with the possessive authority of a man claiming territory that he had decided belonged to him regardless of what the map said. "She belongs to Ravenscar now," he said. "Touch her, and you declare war on me personally." The words landed in the ballroom like cannon fire. Thorn's expression shifted for the first time that evening. The confident architecture of his performance cracked along a fault line he had not anticipated. The possibility that Caedric would choose public exposure over strategic preservation, that the Duke would willingly reveal his own vulnerability rather than sacrifice the woman who had caused it. "You're making a mistake, Your Grace," Thorn said. His voice had lost its parliamentary polish. Something raw showed beneath it, something that sounded like a man who had just watched his opponent flip the chessboard instead of conceding. "I have made many mistakes," Caedric said. "Allowing you to operate inside my territory for 15 years without confrontation was the most expensive. This is the correction." He turned to Brannock, who stood at the east wall with an expression of calculated neutrality that was fracturing at the edges. "Seal the gates. Dismiss the Crown delegation from the East Wing. Move all military assets to defensive positions around the capital district." Brannock hesitated for 1/4 second. Then he nodded and vanished through the service corridor with the urgent efficiency of a man who understood that the next 4 hours would determine whether Ravenscar stood or fell. The ballroom collapsed into chaos. Nobles surged toward the exits. Ministers shouted orders into the crowd. Military officers drew their swords and began establishing perimeter lines along the ballroom walls. The orchestra abandoned their instruments. Crystal glasses shattered against marble floors as servants scrambled to clear tables that no one would ever sit at again. Through the chaos, Thorn stood motionless at the center of the room, watching Caedric with the expression of a man recalculating an equation that had just produced an answer he did not expect. You have just declared yourself against the combined authority of 7 noble houses and the parliamentary structure of the Northern Territories, Thorne said. Your military cannot withstand a 7-front engagement. Your treasury cannot sustain a prolonged siege, and the Crown will not intervene to protect a duke who has just publicly humiliated its diplomatic delegation. The Crown will do whatever preserves the Crown, Caedric said, and right now the Crown needs Ravenscar's naval authority to maintain the northern shipping lanes. The 7 houses you have assembled can threaten my political standing. They cannot replace my strategic value. You are gambling. I am calculating. The difference is that I include variables you failed to account for. Such as? Caedric looked at Seraphina. The look lasted 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, every person in the ballroom who was still paying attention understood that the variable in question was standing beside the Duke, wearing midnight blue, and an expression that contained something no political analysis could quantify, such as the fact that some positions are worth defending even when the mathematics favor retreat. Thorne studied him for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not defeat, but recalibration. The look of a chess player who has lost the opening but sees a deeper game forming beneath the wreckage of his original strategy. You will hear from us before dawn, Your Grace, he said. He turned and walked toward the exit without hurrying. His coalition members fell into formation behind him. Ashworth, Pemberton, Hale, Drayton, Montague, Whitmore, filing through the ballroom doors with the coordinated movement of a military unit withdrawing from contested ground. The ballroom emptied in stages. First the conspirators, then the undecided nobles, fleeing toward neutrality. Then the ministers, calculating their positions. Then the servants, clearing the wreckage of an evening that had begun as a celebration and ended as a declaration of war. Within 20 minutes, the grand hall was empty except for Caedric, Seraphina, and the particular silence that follows detonations. Chandelier candles guttered in the draft from the open doors. Broken crystal glittered across the marble floor like scattered diamonds. The Ravenscar crest hung above the throne in hammered silver, the raven gripping its broken crown with talons that suddenly looked less like decoration and more like the grip of something holding on by force alone. Seraphina pulled her hand from Caedric's grip. He let her. She stepped back and looked at him with an expression that held too many frequencies to resolve into a single emotion. Gratitude and fury and terror and something deeper than all three. You just destroyed everything. I preserved what mattered. You preserved me. At the cost of your political alliance structure, your relationship with Parliament, your defensive positioning against 7 armed houses, and the strategic ambiguity that has kept your enemies uncertain for 15 years. Her voice was shaking, not with weakness, with the particular vibration of someone whose internal architecture was being rebuilt under active fire. You chose a woman you have known for 12 days over an empire you have spent 15 years constructing. Yes. Why? Caedric looked at her. The ballroom was empty. The audience was gone. The performance was over. What remained was 2 people standing in the wreckage of a political order that had existed for 15 years and had been demolished in approximately 4 minutes. Because empires can be rebuilt, he said, and I have never heard anyone play the way you play. The honesty in his voice was so naked it sounded like a wound. Seraphina stared at him. Her eyes glistened in the guttering chandelier light. She opened her mouth to respond. A door slammed somewhere in the castle. Boots on marble. Running. The particular cadence of urgency that distinguished panic from discipline. Brannock appeared at the ballroom entrance. His face was the color of old paper. His composure had abandoned its post entirely, and what remained was raw operational alarm. Your Grace, the North Tower. Report. General Mercer has locked himself inside the North Tower Armory with a detachment of 40 soldiers. They have secured the cannon batteries, the ammunition stores, and the communication tower. Brannock's voice carried the particular flatness of a man delivering information that he understood would fundamentally alter the trajectory of everything that followed. He sent a message by runner 2 minutes ago. What message? Brannock looked at Caedric with an expression that contained something Caedric had never seen in his steward's face before. Something that looked like grief for a man who did not yet know how badly he had been wounded. General Mercer has declared for Thorne's coalition. He is demanding your surrender by dawn. Brannick paused. He says the North Tower's cannon batteries are now targeting the East Wing. The East Wing, Seraphina's quarters. The information arrived in Caedric's nervous system like a blade entering between ribs, yet sharp, precise, and aimed at the one organ that no amount of armor could protect. Mercer, his senior military commander, the man he had trusted with Ravenscar's entire defensive structure. The man he had ordered 6 days ago to mobilize the garrison. Mercer had spent those 6 days mobilizing the garrison against him. Caedric stood in the empty ballroom surrounded by broken crystal and guttering candles and the demolished architecture of everything he had built, and he felt the last structural wall inside his chest give way with a sound that only he could hear. He had been betrayed before. By family. By allies. By the political system he operated within. Every previous betrayal had been absorbed, catalogued, and converted into reinforcement material for the walls he built between himself and the world. This betrayal was different. This betrayal came from inside the fortress, from the man who controlled the weapons, from the person Caedric had trusted with the mechanical systems that kept Ravenscar standing, and the cannons were pointed at the woman he had just told an entire aristocracy he would go to war to protect. Seraphina stood beside him in the shattered ballroom. Her face was white. Her breathing was controlled. She was watching him the way you watch a building that has just taken a direct hit, waiting to see whether the structure holds or whether the damage has reached the foundation. "How long before the cannons can fire?" Caedric asked. His voice was level, operational. The voice of a man who had just lost everything except the ability to function, and who intended to use that ability until it was the last thing he had left. "Mercer's crew can have the batteries loaded and aimed within 30 minutes, Brannick said. Caedric looked at the clock on the ballroom wall. The hands showed 23 minutes past 11. He had 30 minutes to retake his own fortress from the inside. 30 minutes to become something other than the man he had been for 15 years, because the man he had been had trusted the wrong person, fortified the wrong positions, and built walls facing outward while the enemy was already standing at his back. He turned to Seraphina. "Go to the west salon, lock the door, stay away from windows. I am not leaving you. This is not a discussion. You are right. It is not." She stepped forward until she stood close enough for him to feel the heat of her breath against his jaw. "You just told 200 people I belong to Ravenscar. If Ravenscar falls tonight, I fall with it. So either we survive this together, or we do not survive it at all." Caedric looked at her for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the last operational protocol he maintained, the one that said attachment was weakness, that trust was exposure, that needing another person was the fastest route to destruction, buckled under the weight of a woman who refused to be protected at the cost of standing beside him. "Brannick," he said. "The armory beneath the throne hall. How many weapons?" "Enough. Rally every guard still loyal. Send runners to the harbor garrison, and find me the architectural plans for the North Tower's ventilation system." Brannick nodded once and disappeared into the darkness of the castle corridors. Caedric turned toward the armory entrance beneath the throne. His black coat was still immaculate. His metals still gleamed. His posture still communicated absolute authority over every square foot of stone surrounding him. But the man wearing the coat was no longer the man who had put it on that evening. That man had governed through isolation, through control, through the absolute refusal to let another heartbeat synchronize with his own. The man walking toward the armory now had a second heartbeat walking beside him in midnight blue, and he understood with the terrifying clarity of a commander who has just watched his own battle plan collapse that everything he knew about survival was about to be rewritten by the next 30 minutes. The clock struck 11:24. The cannons waited. The armory beneath the throne hall smelled like iron and old leather, and the particular metallic tang of weapons that had been maintained by men who understood that rust was the difference between survival and a funeral attended by people who had caused it. Caedric descended the stone stairs 3 at a time. His boots struck each step with percussive force that echoed through the underground corridor like a heartbeat amplified by stone. Behind him, Seraphina moved with a speed that contradicted the midnight blue gown she was still wearing, and confirmed something Caedric had suspected since the day she rode 3 miles through coastal ice alone. This woman operated at a frequency that most people could not sustain, and she had been operating at reduced capacity since the moment she arrived at Ravenscar because nobody had yet given her a reason to stop holding back. Brannick met them at the armory door with a ring of iron keys and an expression that had abandoned its lifelong neutrality for something closer to battlefield clarity. 16 guards confirmed loyal, Brannick said as he turned the lock. Harbor Garrison received the runners 7 minutes ago. Their response time will be 45 minutes at best. We do not have 45 minutes. How many men does Mercer have in the North Tower? 40 confirmed. Possibly more if he recruited from the Night Watch before declaring. Ammunition stores? Full. He requisitioned additional powder supplies 3 days ago under the mobilization order you gave him. Brannick pushed the armory door open. The hinges groaned. Your order, Your Grace, he used your own mobilization directive to arm the position he intended to use against you. The irony was not lost on Caedric. He had ordered Mercer to prepare Ravenscar for war. Mercer had obeyed perfectly. The war was simply not the one Caedric had intended. He stepped into the armory and began pulling weapons from the wall racks with the efficient selectivity of a man who understood that armament choices in close-quarters combat were not about firepower, but about speed, weight, and the ability to function in confined stone corridors where a long blade became a liability and a short one became salvation. 2 pistols, a military knife with a 7-inch blade, a secondary blade strapped to his left forearm beneath his coat sleeve. The ventilation system, he said while loading the first pistol. The North Tower's air supply runs through stone channels built into the original fortress construction. 3 primary shafts, 2 on the eastern face, 1 on the western. Brannick nodded. The western shaft connects to the service tunnels beneath the kitchens. It is wide enough for a single man. It is wide enough for me. The statement landed in the armory with the weight of a decision that could not be unmade. Brannick looked at his employer with the expression of a man who had served Ravenscar for 23 years and had never once seen the Duke propose entering a combat situation through a ventilation shaft like a common saboteur rather than commanding from a fortified position like the aristocratic military leader he was supposed to be. Your Grace, if Mercer has posted sentries inside the shaft, then I will deal with them inside the shaft. Alone. The shaft does not accommodate a formation. It accommodates one man. That man will be me. Caedric holstered the second pistol and pulled his coat tight across his chest. The metals clinked once. He removed them, 3 silver crosses and a gold parliamentary commendation, and set them on the armory table with the deliberate finality of a man removing decorations that belonged to a version of himself that no longer applied to the current situation. Brannick, I need you to take the 16 loyal guards and create a visible assault formation at the North Tower's main entrance. Full lanterns, maximum noise. Make Mercer believe the attack is coming through the front. A diversion. A distraction. While Mercer focuses his 40 men on the main door, I enter through the ventilation shaft and reach the cannon control room from inside the tower. And do what? Disable the firing mechanisms before he can give the order. The plan was insane. Caedric understood this with the clinical detachment of a man who had spent 15 years making rational decisions and had run out of rational options. The ventilation shaft was 140 feet of near-vertical stone channel barely wider than his shoulders. The cannon control room sat at the top of the North Tower behind a reinforced iron door that Mercer had almost certainly barricaded. If any part of the operation failed, if the shaft was blocked, if sentries were posted, if his grip slipped on the stone, if Mercer gave the firing order before he reached the control room, the cannons would fire on the east wing and everything he had just declared he would protect would be destroyed by the weapons of his own fortress. The mathematics were not favorable, but mathematics had stopped governing his decisions approximately 2 hours ago when he crossed a ballroom and took the hand of a woman who made him want to survive for reasons that had nothing to do with power. Seraphina, he said without turning around, I heard the plan. And you are going to climb 140 feet through a stone shaft in the dark, while 40 armed soldiers wait at the top, because the alternative is letting your own cannons destroy the woman you just publicly claimed. That is an accurate summary. It is a suicide summary. He turned to face her. The armory light was dim. 2 lanterns throwing orange shadows across walls lined with enough weaponry to equip a small army. In that light, her face looked carved from something harder than the stones surrounding them. Her eyes held no tears, no softness, nothing that resembled the fragility that most people associated with women whose lives were being actively threatened by artillery. She looked like someone doing math in her head and arriving at numbers that made her furious rather than afraid. "The cannon batteries require a crew of 6 to operate," she said. 3 on the loading mechanism, 2 on the elevation controls, 1 on the firing chain. If you reach the control room and disable the firing chain, the cannons become inert. Caedric studied her. "How do you know the crew configuration of Ravenscar's cannon batteries?" "Because I spent 3 days learning the defensive systems of this fortress while you were busy reading intelligence documents and pretending you were not listening to me play piano." She stepped forward. The firing chain runs through a mechanical linkage bolted to the floor of the control room. 4 bolts. Standard military hexagonal heads. If you remove 2 of the 4 bolts, the chain disengages and the firing mechanism cannot be activated until the linkage is reset. "You memorized the mechanical specifications of my cannon systems." "I memorize everything. It is the only survival mechanism that has never failed me." Caedric looked at her for a long moment. The clock in his head was counting down. 22 minutes until Mercer's batteries could be loaded and aimed. Every second spent in this armory was a second not spent inside the ventilation shaft. But the woman standing in front of him had just demonstrated something that reconfigured his understanding of who she was and what she was capable of at a fundamental level. She had studied his fortress not to escape it, but to understand it. She had memorized his defensive systems not as intelligence for an enemy, but as knowledge that might one day be needed by an ally. She had been preparing to help him without knowing she would need to, because preparation was what people did when they intended to stay. "Brannock," Caedric said, "give Lady Vale a sidearm." Brannock hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he removed a compact pistol from the wall rack, checked the loading mechanism, and handed it to Seraphina grip first. She took it with the practiced comfort of someone who had handled firearms before. "I want you in the West Salon with 4 guards," Caedric told her. Stone walls. Interior position, the salon is outside the cannon targeting arc. "I know. I calculated the arc 3 days ago." He almost smiled. The expression did not quite reach his mouth, but it traveled through his eyes with enough warmth to be visible in the lantern light, and Seraphina caught it with the precision of a woman who had been tracking his micro-expressions since the day she arrived. 20 minutes, he said. 19, she corrected. "You have been standing here for 3 minutes longer than you should have." He moved toward the armory's rear entrance, where a narrow service corridor led to the kitchen tunnels beneath the castle. At the doorway, he stopped without turning around. "If I do not reach the control room in time—" "You will reach it!" "If I do not?" "Then I will find another way to disable the batteries. But you will reach it, Caedric, because you are too stubborn and too angry and too inconveniently in love with control to die inside a ventilation shaft before finishing what you started." He turned his head just enough to see her profile in the lantern light. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. The pistol rested in her right hand with the natural alignment of a weapon held by someone who understood what weapons were for and had made peace with the possibility of using one. He left without another word. Some sentences did not require responses. They required proof. The service tunnels beneath Ravenscar Keep were older than the fortress itself. Cut into the cliff stone during the original construction 300 years ago, they ran beneath the kitchens, the wine cellars, the coal stores, and the mechanical systems that supplied water, heat, and ventilation to the castle's massive structure. The air was cold and tasted like mineral deposits and ancient dust. The only light came from Caedric's single lantern, which he carried in his left hand while his right rested on the pistol at his hip. He moved fast, not running. The tunnel floor was too uneven, the ceiling too low in places for a man his height to risk the speed that running required. But fast. The kind of speed that belonged to someone who understood that time was ammunition, and he was spending it with every step that did not bring him closer to the North Tower shaft. The tunnel branched 3 times. He took each turn from memory, navigating by the mental map he had constructed when he first took possession of Ravenscar at 19 years old. A boy who had just inherited a fortress from a family that had tried to destroy him, and who had spent his first week as Duke memorizing every corridor, every tunnel, every hidden passage, because a man who did not know his own building could be trapped inside it by anyone who did. That boy's paranoia was saving the man's life tonight. He reached the western ventilation shaft 9 minutes after leaving the armory. The shaft opening was a 4-foot square of blackness cut into the stone wall at shoulder height. Cold air poured from it, the draft created by temperature differential between the heated tower above and the frozen tunnels below. The shaft rose vertically for approximately 140 feet through the interior wall of the north tower, with iron maintenance handholds spaced every 3 feet for the chimney sweeps and mechanics who serviced the ventilation system twice yearly. Caedric extinguished the lantern and set it on the tunnel floor. Darkness became total. He stood in it for 3 seconds, letting his pupils adjust, letting his other senses compensate for the loss of vision. The shaft smelled like stone dust, cold metal, and the faint chemical residue of cannon powder drifting down from the battery rooms above. He removed his coat. The garment was too heavy, too bulky for a vertical climb through a confined stone channel. He folded it once and left it beside the lantern. Without it, the winter air hit his torso through the thin military shirt beneath and immediately began extracting heat from his body at a rate that would become dangerous within 20 minutes. He did not have 20 minutes. He had 14. He gripped the first iron handhold, pulled himself into the shaft, and began climbing. The first 40 feet were mechanical. Grip, pull, brace, reach, grip, pull, brace, reach. His breathing settled into the rhythm of sustained exertion. Controlled intake through the nose, measured exhale through the mouth. The respiratory pattern he had trained into his body during years of physical conditioning that had been motivated less by vanity than by the understanding that a ruler who could not control his own physiology could not control anything else. At 50 feet, his shoulders began burning. The shaft was narrow enough that his elbows scraped stone on every reach, and the iron handholds were cold enough that his grip required constant muscular effort to maintain purchase on metal that wanted to reject his hands. At 70 feet, sweat began running down his spine despite the freezing air. The contradiction was purely mechanical, his core temperature rising from exertion while his extremities lost heat to the stone and iron surrounding him. His fingers were stiffening. The sensation was familiar. He had experienced it during winter combat exercises years ago, the progressive numbing that started at the fingertips and crawled toward the palm with the patient certainty of hypothermia announcing its intentions. He kept climbing. At 90 feet, he heard voices above him. 2 men, speaking in the clipped, compressed sentences of soldiers on watch. Their voices echoed down the shaft with the metallic distortion that stone channels produced, turning words into sound fragments that arrived out of sequence and required reconstruction. Batteries loaded in 8. General says the Duke will not. East wing first, then the. Caedric stopped climbing. He pressed his back against one wall of the shaft and his boots against the opposite wall, creating a friction hold that freed both hands. His breathing dropped to near silence. The sweat on his shirt was cooling rapidly, and the cold penetrated his chest like a blade made of temperature rather than steel. The sentries were above him. How far above, he could not determine precisely. Sound distortion in the shaft made distance estimation unreliable. 20 feet, 30, close enough that his continued ascent would produce noise they would hear. He drew the 7-inch blade from his belt with his right hand. The metal made no sound leaving its sheath because he had sheathed it with the cutting edge facing forward, a habit drilled into him by a combat instructor who believed that the difference between a silent draw and a noisy one was the difference between a man who left the room standing and a man who left it horizontal. He resumed climbing. Slower now. Each handhold tested for stability before weight transfer. Each breath measured and released through parted lips to minimize respiratory noise. The blade rested between his teeth, the flat of it pressing against his tongue with the taste of oil and iron that he would associate with this night for the rest of his life. At 110 feet, the shaft widened into a maintenance junction where 3 ventilation channels converged before continuing upward toward the tower's upper levels. Dim light filtered down from above, lantern glow from the cannon battery rooms leaking through ventilation grates. 2 soldiers stood in the junction. They were facing the shaft's upper continuation, their backs to Caedric's approach from below. Both carried rifles. Both wore the standard Ravenscar garrison uniform that Caedric had personally designed 4 years ago, dark gray wool with silver thread at the collar. They were his soldiers. They wore his colors. They stood in his fortress, and they had chosen Mercer. Caedric pulled himself into the junction with the silent efficiency of a man who understood that close-quarters combat in confined spaces was decided in the first 2 seconds, and that everything after the first 2 seconds was consequences. The first soldier turned at the faint scrape of boots on stone. His eyes widened, his mouth opened. Caedric's left hand closed over the man's jaw before sound could escape. His right hand drove the blade into the soldier's weapon arm. Not the throat, not the chest, the arm, disabling the rifle grip without killing a man who might have been following orders he believed were legitimate. The soldier's rifle clattered against stone. The sound was sharp, brief. Enough. The second soldier spun. His rifle came up. The barrel swept toward Caedric's chest at a distance of 6 feet in a space barely wide enough for 2 men standing side by side. Caedric released the first soldier, dropped below the rifle's line of fire, and drove his shoulder into the second man's midsection with enough force to slam both of them against the stone wall. The impact traveled through his shoulder into his spine and rattled his teeth. The soldier's rifle discharged upward. The blast was enormous in the confined shaft. A percussive detonation that compressed air, shattered silence, and sent the sound of gunfire cascading up through the ventilation system toward the cannon battery rooms above. Mercer would hear it. Everyone in the tower would hear it. The clock in Caedric's head accelerated. He drove his elbow into the second soldier's temple. The man collapsed. Caedric caught the rifle before it hit the ground, checked the chamber, spent, and discarded it. He pulled his pistol from its holster and looked up the shaft toward the dim light above. Shouting. Boots on stone, the sound of men repositioning above him with the urgency of soldiers who had just realized their perimeter had been breached from a direction they had not fortified. 10 minutes. Maybe less. He climbed. The last 30 feet of the shaft were the fastest and the most dangerous. Speed replaced stealth because stealth was no longer an option after the rifle discharge. His arms burned. His fingers were half numb. Sweat and stone dust coated his hands and made every handhold a negotiation between grip strength and the gravity that waited below him like a patient creditor. He reached the ventilation grate at the top of the shaft and kicked it outward with both boots. The iron grate crashed into the cannon control room and skidded across the stone floor with a sound like a sword being dragged across marble. Caedric pulled himself through the opening and landed in the control room in a crouch. The room was smaller than he remembered from the architectural plans. 30 feet square, low ceiling. The cannon firing mechanism dominated the center. A massive iron assembly of chains, levers, and the 4-bolt mechanical linkage that Seraphina had described with terrifying accuracy. 3 soldiers stood around the mechanism, frozen mid-action by the sight of their Duke emerging from the ventilation shaft with a pistol in one hand, a blade in the other, and an expression that communicated something beyond anger, beyond authority, beyond anything the military training manuals had prepared them to encounter. He looked like a man who had just climbed 140 feet through stone and darkness and the wreckage of 15 years of misplaced trust, and who intended to settle the account in the next 60 seconds. "Step away from the mechanism," he said. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual controlled polish by exertion and cold, and the particular honesty that physical extremity imposed on everything, including language. It did not sound like a Duke's voice. It sounded like the voice of the 19-year-old boy who had inherited this fortress from people who wanted him dead, and had spent every year since then proving that he was harder to kill than they estimated. 2 of the 3 soldiers stepped back immediately. Their faces carried the expression of men who had followed General Mercer's authority because Mercer represented the chain of command, and who were now confronting the reality that the chain of command terminated at a man standing in front of them covered in sweat and stone dust, and the undeniable evidence that he had just done something their general said was impossible. The 3rd soldier did not step back. He was young, 22, maybe 23. His hand rested on the firing chain with the grip of someone who had been given a specific order and intended to follow it regardless of who came through the ventilation grate. "The general ordered the batteries armed," the young soldier said. His voice shook. His hand did not. "The general committed treason." Caedric took 1 step forward. "And you are standing between me and the only thing in this fortress I will kill for." The young soldier looked at the Duke. He looked at the firing chain. He looked at the two soldiers who had already stepped back and whose faces communicated a unanimous recommendation that he do the same. His hand released the chain. Caedric crossed the room in 4 strides, dropped to one knee beside the mechanical linkage, and began removing the firing chain bolts with the blade's edge, used as an improvised wrench. The first bolt resisted. He forced it with enough torque to strip the hexagonal head halfway before it broke free. The second bolt came easier. The firing chain disengaged with a metallic sound that resonated through the control room like the final note of a composition that had been building toward resolution since the moment Seraphina Vale walked into his throne hall 12 days ago. The cannons were inert. Caedric remained on one knee for 3 seconds. His hands were shaking, not from cold, not from exertion, from the particular neurological aftermath of sustained crisis that the body produces when the threat has been neutralized, and the adrenaline that held everything together begins converting itself into tremors that no amount of discipline can suppress. He stood. The control room door burst inward. General Aldrich Mercer entered with 12 armed soldiers behind him and a pistol aimed at Caedric's chest from a distance of 15 feet. Mercer's face was red. His eyes carried the particular wildness of a man whose plan had just been dismantled by someone he had underestimated, and whose remaining options had narrowed to the weapon in his hand and the soldiers at his back. "You should not have come alone," Mercer said. "I did not come alone." Caedric held up the 2 bolts he had removed from the firing mechanism. "I came with the knowledge that my fiancé memorized your cannon specifications better than your own crew did. The batteries are disabled. Your leverage is gone." Mercer's jaw tightened. "The batteries are one weapon. I have 40 men in this tower." "You had 40 men. 3 are neutralized in the ventilation junction. 3 more just watched me disarm the firing mechanism with a knife, and chose to step aside rather than die for a general who is standing on the wrong side of history." Caedric's breathing was still ragged. His shirt was soaked with sweat that the cold air was turning into a second skin of ice against his torso. Blood from scraped knuckles dripped onto the stone floor in a rhythm that sounded almost deliberate. "How many of your remaining 34 are willing to fire on their Duke inside his own fortress, General?" Mercer looked at his soldiers. The 12 men behind him stood with weapons raised, but their eyes were moving between their general and their Duke with the particular calculation of men who were rapidly revising their assessment of which authority figure was more dangerous to disobey. "You are outnumbered," Mercer said, but his voice had lost the confidence that made command sound like inevitability, and what replaced it was the desperate conviction of a man arguing against mathematics he could already see. "I climbed 140 feet through a ventilation shaft, disarmed 2 sentries, disabled your cannon batteries, and I am standing in your control room with a pistol and a knife and the complete willingness to use both." Caedric took 1 step forward. Mercer's pistol did not waver, but the hand holding it did. "You served Ravenscar for 11 years, Aldrich. You ate at my table. You trained my soldiers. You held command authority over every defensive system in this province because I trusted you with it." Another step. "And you sold that trust to a man who promised you a title and a treasury position in whatever government he intended to build on the ashes of everything we constructed together." "You gave me no choice." Mercer's voice cracked on the last word. "Thorne showed me what was coming. 7 houses, parliamentary authority, the crown's support. You were going to lose everything, and you were going to drag every soldier in this garrison down with you because you are too arrogant to surrender and too damaged to compromise. And your solution was to point my own cannons at the woman I love." The word landed in the control room like a detonation. Caedric heard it leave his mouth and felt the structural implications travel through his entire body like a shockwave. He had not planned to say it. He had not rehearsed it. The word had bypassed every filter, every protocol, every 15-year-old defense system he had built to prevent exactly this kind of uncontrolled disclosure. But it was true. And the truth, once spoken in a room full of armed men during a confrontation that would determine the future of everything he had built, could not be recalled any more than a fired bullet could be returned to its chamber. Mercer stared at him. The pistol in his hand wavered. The 12 soldiers behind him shifted. The atmospheric pressure in the control room underwent a phase change as 37 people collectively processed the fact that the Duke of Ravenscar, the man who did not flinch, did not bend, did not show, had just said the word love inside his own cannon tower while covered in blood and sweat and stone dust, and the demolished remains of every wall he had ever built between himself and vulnerability. The door behind Mercer's soldiers opened. Brannock's voice carried through the gap with the calm precision of a man delivering the final piece of information in a sequence that had been carefully timed. "General Mercer, the harbor garrison has arrived. 84 soldiers. They are currently surrounding the North Tower at every exit." A pause. "And Lady Vale asked me to deliver a message." "What message?" Caedric said. "She said, 'Tell him the West Salon piano is out of tune and I expect it fixed by morning.'" Something happened to Caedric's face. Not a smile. Not quite. Something that lived in the territory between exhaustion and recognition. The expression of a man who had just received confirmation that the person he had risked everything for was alive, unharmed, and irritated about a piano. He looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at the disabled cannon mechanism. He looked at the soldiers behind him whose conviction was visibly deteriorating. He looked at the door where Brannock's voice had just announced that 84 additional soldiers had eliminated every exit strategy the North Tower possessed. The pistol in Mercer's hand trembled, and from somewhere far below the tower, rising through stone corridors and ventilation shafts, and the ancient architecture of a fortress that had survived 3 centuries of conflict, came a sound that should not have been audible at this distance, but somehow was. Piano music. Violent. Beautiful. Uncontainable. Playing in a castle that was still standing because a man had climbed through darkness to reach the thing that mattered, and a woman had refused to stop playing until he came back. Mercer's pistol lowered by 1 inch. Then 2. The pistol hit the stone floor before Mercer's knees did. The sound was small, metal striking stone with a flat, definitive clap that echoed through the cannon control room and then died the way all sounds die in enclosed spaces, absorbed by walls that had witnessed centuries of decisions made under duress and would witness centuries more. Mercer's knees followed half a second later, not in surrender exactly, but in the structural failure of a man whose conviction had been the only thing keeping him vertical, and whose conviction had just been disassembled by the combined force of 84 soldiers surrounding his position, disabled cannon batteries, and the sound of a woman playing piano somewhere below them, as though the entire siege were an inconvenience she intended to outlast through sheer artistic stubbornness. Caedric did not move. He stood 7 feet from his former general, with blood drying on his knuckles and stone dust coating the sweat-soaked shirt that clung to his torso like a second layer of exhaustion made visible. His pistol remained in his right hand. His breathing was still uneven, the residual respiratory debt of a 140-foot vertical climb that his body would be calculating the cost of for days. The 12 soldiers behind Mercer lowered their weapons in sequence, not simultaneously. One by one, in the order of their diminishing conviction, like dominoes falling along a line that had been inevitable since the moment their duke pulled himself through a ventilation grate and stood in front of them looking like something between a commander and a man who had crawled through his own wreckage to get here. "Brannock," Caedric said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual controlled resonance by cold air and physical extremity, and the particular rawness that truth imposes on vocal cords after it has been spoken without permission. "Secure the tower. Disarm every soldier. Confine General Mercer to the lower detention chamber." "Your Grace." Brannock appeared in the doorway with 4 harbor garrison soldiers flanking him. His composure had been reinstalled during the intervening minutes, but the seams were visible, the particular tightness around his eyes that indicated a man who had spent the last half hour managing the logistics of a military rescue operation while simultaneously processing the fact that his employer had just done something that no previous Duke of Ravenscar had ever attempted or ever would have considered attempting. Mercer did not resist when the garrison soldiers pulled him to his feet. He stood between them with his arms at his sides and his head lowered, and the broken posture of a man who had gambled on the wrong version of the future and was now inhabiting the version where that gamble had cost him everything. "Aldrich," Caedric said. Mercer looked up. His eyes were red. Not from tears. Mercer was not the kind of man who cried, even in collapse. From exhaustion and the particular vascular response that extreme stress produces in the human face, a reddening that looks like grief but is actually the body's mechanical acknowledgement that it has been running on crisis chemistry for too long. "I trusted you," Caedric said. The words were not an accusation. They were an inventory. A factual statement delivered with the flat precision of a man cataloging what had been lost so he could begin calculating what it would cost to rebuild. More than any officer in this garrison, more than any person in this castle except Brannock. You had my complete confidence. Mercer's jaw worked. The muscles flexed beneath skin that had aged 5 years and 4 hours. Your confidence was a cage, Caedric. You trusted me the way you trust a weapon, perfectly maintained, perfectly controlled, aimed wherever you decided. I served you for 11 years and never once felt like a man in your presence, only like a mechanism. The words landed in Caedric's chest with surgical accuracy, not because they were unfair, because they were true. And the truth of them, the recognition that his method of trusting people had been indistinguishable from his method of maintaining artillery, precise, functional, and completely devoid of the mutual recognition that separated trust from inventory management, opened a door inside him that he had not known existed until this moment. He had treated loyalty as a mechanical system, input, output, maintenance schedule, performance review. And the system had failed, not because the components were defective, but because mechanical systems do not account for the fact that human beings require something beyond functional precision to remain loyal. They require the belief that their loyalty is being received by a person, not processed by an institution. Take him, Caedric said quietly. The garrison soldiers escorted Mercer from the control room. His boots scraped against the stone floor with the shuffling cadence of a man who no longer had a destination worth walking toward with purpose. The sound faded down the tower staircase and was eventually replaced by the ambient noise of a fortress transitioning from active crisis to the exhausted administrative aftermath of a night that had changed the structural composition of everything inside its walls. Caedric remained in the control room alone. He walked to the cannon battery and placed his hand on the iron firing mechanism he had disabled. The metal was cold beneath his palm. The 2 missing bolts left gaps in the linkage assembly that looked like wounds, small, precise points of absence that had rendered the entire system inert. 2 bolts. The difference between destruction and survival had been 2 hexagonal bolts that a woman memorized during 3 days of studying a fortress she had not been asked to learn, because she had decided on her own that understanding the architecture of Ravenscar was worth more than resenting the fact that she had been imprisoned inside it. He leaned forward until his forehead rested against the iron mechanism. The cold metal pressed against his skin. His eyes closed. His breathing finally began to slow, not through discipline, but through the body's involuntary recognition that the crisis had passed and the chemical scaffolding that had held him together through the last 2 hours was being systematically dismantled by a nervous system that demanded payment for services rendered. He stayed there for 4 minutes. Then he straightened, retrieved his pistol, and descended the north tower staircase toward whatever remained of the castle he had spent 15 years building and one night demolishing in order to rebuild it into something worth protecting. The grand ballroom looked like a battlefield that had been dressed for a dinner party. Broken crystal covered the marble floor in patterns that caught the remaining chandelier light and scattered it in fragments across walls stained with spilled wine that looked disturbingly like blood in the low illumination. Overturned chairs, abandoned instruments. A cello lying on its side near the orchestra platform, with its strings still vibrating faintly from the impact of its fall, producing a low harmonic hum that sounded like the room itself was processing what had happened inside it. Caedric crossed the ballroom without stopping. His boots crunched on crystal. The sound followed him like punctuation, each step breaking something that had been whole, each broken thing making way for a path that had not existed before he walked through it. He reached the west salon door at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning. The piano music had stopped. He opened the door. Seraphina sat on the piano bench with the compact pistol resting on the music stand where sheet music should have been. Her midnight blue gown was creased from hours of sitting in the same position. Her hair had come loose from its crystal pins, falling around her shoulders in dark auburn disorder that made her look less like a duchess and more like a woman who had spent the night preparing to fight or die and had somehow ended up doing neither. 4 guards stood along the salon walls. They snapped to attention when Caedric entered. He dismissed them with a single movement of his head, and they filed out with the silent efficiency of soldiers who understood that the conversation about to happen in this room was not something they were meant to witness. The door closed. Caedric and Seraphina looked at each other across 20 feet of fire-lit salon. He was covered in stone dust. Blood had dried on his knuckles in dark crusts that cracked when he flexed his fingers. His shirt was soaked with sweat that the cold air had transformed into a damp second skin. His hair had come loose from its severe arrangement and fell across his forehead in dark strands that made him look younger and more damaged than the man who had stood on this castle's throne 12 days ago and told her she was 6 feet too far. She studied him with the particular attention of a woman who was cataloging injuries not to assess damage but to confirm survival. "The cannons," she said. "Disabled. 2 bolts, exactly as you described." "Mercer. Confined. The tower is secured." "The coalition." "Thorne's forces withdrew before the harbor garrison arrived. The 7 houses will regroup. The fight is not over." He paused. "But it is not tonight." Seraphina exhaled. The sound was long and controlled and carried the particular resonance of someone releasing tension that had been compressed to a density her body could no longer sustain. She looked down at the piano keys. Her fingers rested on the ivory without pressing down, hovering above the notes the way his hand had hovered above hers in the ballroom before he made the decision that changed everything. "You said something in the tower," she said. "I said many things in the tower." "You said love." The word sat in the salon like an object that had been placed on a table and could not be removed. Caedric heard it and felt the same structural shift he had felt when it left his mouth 40 minutes ago. The sensation of a load-bearing wall being removed from a building and the building remaining standing anyway, not because the wall had been unnecessary, but because the remaining structure had compensated for its absence by distributing weight in ways the original architect had not designed for. "I said it to a room full of armed soldiers during a standoff with a man who was pointing a pistol at my chest," he said. The context was not ideal for emotional declarations. The context was the only honest context you have ever had. She stood from the piano bench. The pistol remained on the music stand. She left it there deliberately, a signal that the conversation she intended to have did not involve weapons, and that whatever happened between them in the next few minutes would be conducted without the option of retreat for either party. "You have spent 15 years constructing environments where honesty is impossible. Council chambers, throne halls, diplomatic receptions. Every room you enter is designed so that performance replaces truth and control replaces vulnerability." She walked toward him. "The only honest thing you have ever said came out of your mouth when you were exhausted, bleeding, outnumbered, and too spent to maintain the performance. That does not make it less true." "I know." She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to see the stone dust in the lines around his eyes, close enough to smell the iron and sweat and cold air that clung to him like evidence of what he had done to reach this moment. "It makes it the only true thing you have ever said to another person." Caedric looked at her. The fire crackled behind them. The castle was quiet for the first time in hours, the particular silence that follows crisis, when every sound that was drowned by urgency suddenly becomes audible again. A clock ticking in the corridor, wind against the windows, the faint creak of ancient timbers adjusting to temperature changes that the castle's 300-year-old structure processed the same way it processed everything. Slowly, steadily, with the patience of something built to outlast the temporary storms that passed through it. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "Do what?" "Stand in a room with someone and not calculate the exits." Seraphina reached up and placed both hands on either side of his face. Her palms were warm against his cold skin. Her fingers pressed into the stone dust at his temples and left clean tracks where they touched, as though she were uncovering something that had been buried beneath layers of grit and discipline and the accumulated residue of 15 years spent becoming untouchable. "Then stop calculating," she said. "Just stand." He closed his eyes. The sensation that moved through him was not dramatic, not explosive, not the cinematic detonation that stories use to describe moments of emotional transformation. It was quieter than that, smaller. The feeling of a man who had been holding his own weight for 15 years suddenly allowing a fraction of that weight to rest against another person's hands, and discovering that the transfer did not make him weaker. It redistributed the load, and the redistribution made it possible to remain standing when his own architecture was no longer sufficient. He opened his eyes. "The piano is out of tune," he said. She almost laughed. The sound did not quite complete itself. It started as a breath and ended as something closer to a release, the vocal equivalent of a knot being untied. I know, I have been playing it all night. 2 of the upper register strings are flat, and the sustain pedal sticks on the 3rd beat. I will have it repaired. You will have it replaced. That piano has survived a siege tonight, and it deserved better maintenance before the siege started. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened to his face that had not happened in this castle since before she arrived, something that his court had never witnessed, and his enemies would not have believed. The muscles around his eyes softened. His jaw unclenched. The architectural severity of his expression gave way to something that was not a smile but was adjacent to one, the expression of a man who had just discovered that the most heavily fortified position in his entire kingdom was not the North Tower, or the cannon batteries, or the walls he had built around himself, but the 3 feet of space between his body and a woman who had refused to stop playing music during a military crisis, because stopping would have meant admitting that the crisis mattered more than the art. I will replace the piano, he said. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. She lowered her hands from his face and placed her right palm flat against his chest, over his heart, in the same position she had used on the battlements when she first measured the distance between who he pretended to be and who he actually was. His heartbeat pressed against her hand, slower than it had been on the battlements, steadier. The rhythm of a man whose internal machinery was beginning to operate at a tempo he had not allowed himself to experience since he was 19 years old and still believed that other people could be trusted with the vulnerable fact of his existence. Your heart is not racing, she said. No. Why? He covered her hand with his fingers were raw, his knuckles were cracked and blood-stained. The hand that closed over hers was not the hand of a duke or a governor or a military commander. It was the hand of a man who had climbed through darkness and come out the other side holding something he was no longer willing to let go of. Because the right woman is touching me, he said, at the right moment, in the right place. She pressed her forehead against his chest. He rested his chin on top of her head. They stood that way in the firelit salon, while the clock in the corridor ticked and the wind pressed against the windows, and Ravenscar Keep settled around them with the deep structural patience of a fortress that had learned something new tonight about what it was built to protect. The aftermath took months. Spring arrived in Valemount the way spring arrives in northern provinces, reluctantly, in stages, with long pauses between each concession of warmth, as though the season itself needed to verify that winter was actually finished before committing to anything permanent. The seven-house coalition fractured within 6 weeks. Without Mercer's military leverage, and without the element of surprise, Thorne's political alliance deteriorated into a collection of individual noble families scrambling to secure their own positions before the consequences of their conspiracy reached them. Ashworth defected first, offering Ravenscar a full intelligence report in exchange for reduced penalties. Pemberton followed 3 days later. By the end of the second month, only Thorne himself remained in open opposition, and his parliamentary support had eroded to the point where his speeches attracted more sympathy than allegiance. The particular political extinction that occurs when a man continues fighting after the war has been decided by everyone except himself. The Crown's response was calculated with the institutional precision that crowns employed when managing regional crises that could have destabilized their authority, but had instead, through a combination of unpredictable variables, reinforced it. Ravenscar's control of the northern shipping lanes gave Caedric leverage that no parliamentary motion could override. The Crown needed his navy. His navy needed his authority. His authority had just survived a seven-house conspiracy, a military betrayal, and a night that should have destroyed him, but instead demonstrated to every political observer in the Northern Territories that the Duke of Ravenscar was substantially more difficult to remove than anyone had estimated. The engagement became a formal marriage on a Tuesday in April. Not a grand ceremony. Not a parliamentary spectacle with hundreds of noble families arranged in galleries wearing calculated expressions of support. Seraphina had been specific about this. I have been displayed enough, she told Caedric during the planning discussions that occurred in the war chamber because neither of them considered the dining hall a suitable venue for decisions. If we do this, we do it for us, not for an audience. The ceremony took place in the West Salon. Brannock stood as witness. A magistrate from the capital district performed the legal requirements with efficient brevity. Seraphina wore a dark green dress that matched nothing traditional and everything about who she actually was. Caedric wore his military coat with no medals. He had not replaced the medals he removed in the armory the night of the siege. He never would. The piano was new. Seraphina had selected it herself from a maker in the southern provinces, a concert instrument with an iron frame and brass strings that produced a sound dense enough to fill the salon without amplification and clear enough to carry through stone corridors to the war chamber where Caedric worked at 2 a.m. while pretending he was studying maps. He no longer pretended. When the music started, he closed his maps, left the war chamber, and walked to the salon. Sometimes he sat in the chair beside the fireplace and listened with his eyes closed. Sometimes he stood in the doorway and watched her play with the undisguised attention of a man who had stopped caring whether observation constituted vulnerability. Sometimes he brought documents and read them while she played, the two of them occupying the same room in comfortable parallel, sharing space without the need to fill it with conversation. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the charged adversarial silence of two people calculating each other's positions. It was the silence of a shared frequency. The particular quiet that exists between people who have survived the same detonation and no longer need to explain to each other what the blast felt like. Mercer's trial concluded in May. The military tribunal found him guilty of treason against ducal authority. The sentence was imprisonment, not execution. Caedric made this decision personally, overriding 3 tribunal judges who argued that precedent demanded the maximum penalty. Precedent demands whatever the current authority decides it demands, Caedric told the tribunal, and the current authority has decided that killing a man for choosing the wrong side of a political conflict is the behavior of a ruler who is afraid of dissent. I am not afraid of dissent. I am afraid of becoming the kind of leader whose people follow him because the alternative is death, rather than because the alternative is worse governance. The tribunal recorded the statement. Brannock, who was present as administrative observer, recorded something else entirely. The particular expression on Caedric's face as he delivered the ruling, an expression that contained none of the cold satisfaction that previous Ravenscar judgments had produced, and all of the measured weight of a man who understood that the decision not to kill was sometimes harder and always more expensive than the decision to kill, and who had chosen the harder option because someone had taught him that fortresses built on fear eventually ran out of people willing to live inside them. He did not say Seraphina's name during the tribunal. He did not need to. Lord Damien Vale was arrested in June. Seraphina received the news in the salon where she spent her mornings reviewing the administrative correspondence of the Northern Orphan School system she had established during the first months of spring. The schools now operated in 14 districts across Valemont, staffed by teachers recruited from the university system and funded by a treasury allocation that Caedric had approved without discussion when Seraphina presented the budget. "Your brother has been taken into Crown custody," Caedric said from the doorway. Seraphina set down her pen. She looked at the window for a long time. Outside, the harbor was alive with merchant ships whose passage through the northern sea lanes was guaranteed by the same Ravenscar naval authority that her brother had tried to dismantle. "What will happen to him?" "Crown Tribunal. The charges are conspiracy and armed sedition. The penalties are severe." "Can you intervene?" "I can recommend leniency. The Crown may listen, they may not." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her desk, the same chair he occupied when they worked in parallel during the evenings. He with military correspondence, and she with educational administration, sharing a room the way they shared everything now, with the practiced comfort of 2 people who had discovered that proximity did not require performance. "Do you want me to?" She looked at him. The question was not simple, and she did not treat it as though it were. Her brother had sold her, had used her sacrifice as strategic positioning, had signed documents that would have resulted in the destruction of everything she had built inside these walls, the schools, the administrative systems, the marriage, the life she had chosen to construct from the wreckage of the one she had been forced into. Damien had treated her as currency, as a mechanism, as a component in a system designed to achieve outcomes that did not include her survival or her happiness. And he was still her brother. "Recommend leniency," she said, "not because he deserves it, because I do not want to become the kind of person who lets family members die in prison when I have the power to prevent it. That is his behavior, not mine." Caedric studied her for a long time. The afternoon light moved across her face as clouds shifted over the harbor, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that made her look like a portrait being painted by a sun that could not decide which version of her it wanted to preserve. "You are a more difficult person to deserve than I originally estimated," he said. "You are a slower learner than I originally estimated, but you are learning." He almost smiled. The expression reached his eyes this time. It happened more frequently now, not the controlled absence of expression that his court had always interpreted as authority, but the gradual emergence of something beneath the authority that looked suspiciously like the face he might have had if 15 years of betrayal had not taught him to keep it locked behind performance. He was learning to let it show. Not always. Not with everyone. Caedric Ravenscar would never be a man who governed through warmth or led with emotional transparency. The fortress was part of him. The walls were structural, not decorative. Removing them entirely would have been as destructive as building them had been. A man without boundaries was as dangerous as a man without connections. And the goal was not to become undefended, but to become selectively defended, to know which walls to maintain and which doors to build into them. Seraphina had not softened him. She had given him architecture that included entrances. The winter masquerade arrived on the anniversary of the night the world changed. Ravenscar Keep blazed with light for the second time in a year, but the light carried a different quality now. The chandeliers were the same. The candles were the same. The marble ballroom floor had been repaired where crystal and blood and spilled wine had stained it during the midwinter assembly collapse, and the repairs were invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. But the atmosphere was different. The particular tension that had permeated every formal gathering at Ravenscar for 15 years, the ambient anxiety of people who attended events hosted by a man they feared, had been replaced by something else. Not relaxation exactly. Caedric's court would never be relaxed, but the fear had been diluted by something that fear had never previously shared space with inside these walls. Respect. Not the respect that came from intimidation. The respect that came from watching a man climb through a ventilation shaft to disable his own cannons rather than sacrifice the person he loved. The respect that came from watching a woman build 14 schools across a province that had previously spent its educational budget on military exercises. The respect that came from the slow, visible demonstration that Ravenscar authority had not weakened but had expanded to include priorities beyond domination. The ballroom filled with noble families who had spent the previous year recalibrating their understanding of what the Duke of Ravenscar was capable of. Some had been conspirators. Some had been neutral. Some had been loyal throughout. All of them watched the entrance to the grand staircase with the particular attention of people who understood that the couple about to descend those stairs had survived something that should have destroyed both of them and had instead become the foundation of whatever Ravenscar was becoming. Caedric appeared at the top of the staircase in black military formal. No medals. He had never replaced them, and their absence had become a statement more powerful than their presence. A visible reminder that the man wearing the coat had deliberately removed the decorations of his old identity and had not yet decided what the new identity deserved to wear in their place. Seraphina stood beside him in deep emerald silk. Crystal pins held her dark auburn hair in an arrangement that was severe and architectural and entirely her own. The compact pistol she had carried during the siege was not visible tonight, but 3 people in the room knew she owned 1 and 2 of them suspected she could use it with accuracy that would embarrass several of the military officers standing along the ballroom walls. They descended the staircase together, not with the adversarial geometry of the midwinter assembly, where the distance between them had been measured in political calculation and unresolved tension. Together, his hand on the small of her back, her stride matching his. 2 people moving through a space that had once been a battlefield and was now something closer to a home. Though neither of them would have used that word because both of them understood that homes were not declared but demonstrated, and the demonstration was ongoing. At the base of the staircase, Caedric stopped. The ballroom watched. He turned to face Seraphina with the full attention of a man who had spent his life directing that attention toward threats, and was now directing it toward something he had decided mattered more than any threat he had ever faced. 1 year ago, he said quietly enough that only she could hear, "You walked into this hall and stood 6 feet too far from the throne. And you made me wait 3 hours in a reception room because you thought patience was a demonstration of authority." It was a demonstration of fear. I knew what you were the moment Brannock told me you rode 3 miles through ice alone. His hand moved from the small of her back to her hand. He held it the way he held it on the night of the assembly, openly, publicly, in front of every person whose opinion of the gesture ranged from admiration to confusion to the grudging acknowledgement that the Duke of Ravenscar had become a substantially more complicated man than the one they had feared for 15 years. I was afraid of someone who did not need my castle or my title or my authority, someone who arrived with nothing except her own competence and her refusal to lower her eyes. Every other person in this kingdom needed something from me. You needed nothing. And a man who cannot be needed by the person he wants is the most vulnerable man alive. Seraphina looked at him. The chandelier light moved across her green eyes, and in them he saw the reflection of a ballroom that had witnessed betrayal and violence, and the particular destruction that occurs when power collides with the human need to be known by another person. And he saw something else, something that had been building in those eyes since the first morning on the battlements when she told him he breathed louder than he thought. Patience. Not the passive kind. The active, structural patience of a woman who had decided to stay inside a fortress with a man who did not know how to let anyone in, and who had waited not for him to change but for him to recognize that the change had already happened, and that the only remaining task was to stop pretending it had not. "I needed something from you," she said. "What?" "Honesty. And you gave it to me in a cannon tower at 2 a.m. while covered in blood and stone dust. It was the most romantic and least appropriate moment possible." She squeezed his hand, which is why it was the only moment I believed. Caedric lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. The gesture was slow, deliberate, performed in full view of every noble, minister, general, and servant in the ballroom, with the complete disregard for audience that characterized a man who had finally understood that the most powerful thing a ruler could do in a room full of people watching him for weakness was to show them exactly what he cared about and dare them to use it against him. The ballroom was silent. Not the hostile silence of the midwinter assembly, not the charged silence of the throne hall on the day she arrived. A different silence, the kind that fills a room when a large number of people simultaneously witness something they did not expect to see and do not yet have the vocabulary to describe. The orchestra began playing. Caedric drew Seraphina onto the ballroom floor. They danced the way they did everything, with precision, intensity, and the particular synchronization of two people whose rhythms had been calibrated by crisis and refined by the daily, undramatic work of learning to occupy the same life without destroying each other or themselves. The court watched. Brannock watched from the east wall with an expression that had finally abandoned its professional neutrality in favor of something that looked, for the first time in 23 years of service, like satisfaction. Outside, winter pressed against the castle walls. The northern sea churned beneath the cliffs. Snow fell across Valemount in the heavy, silent curtains that made the northern provinces feel like a world separated from the rest of civilization by distance and weather, and the particular isolation that came from living at the edge of an empire. But inside Ravenscar Keep, for the first time in 15 years, the isolation felt chosen rather than imposed. The walls that had been built to keep the world out were still standing. The cannon towers still rose above the cliffs. The fortress still projected the authority that made enemy ships change course rather than pass beneath its shadow. The difference was that the man inside the fortress was no longer alone, and the music that drifted through its corridors at 2 a.m, violent, beautiful, uncontainable, was no longer the sound of someone playing because nobody was listening. It was the sound of someone playing because she knew exactly who was listening, and she intended to keep playing until the fortress itself learned to resonate at a frequency it had never been built for, but had somehow, against every structural principle, learned to sustain. Caedric held Seraphina on the ballroom floor while the orchestra played and the court watched, and the winter pressed against the windows. His heart was not racing, it was steady, and for the first time in his life, the steadiness did not come from control. It came from the absence of the need for it.